My name is Emily Carter, and I was 17 years old the night my mother slapped me in front of her new husband. I still remember the sound more than the pain. It was sharp, like the crack of a dry branch snapping in two. My cheek burned hot before my brain could even register what had happened. For a split second, the room was silent, so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the next room and the faint ticking of the old wall clock. My eyes stung. Not from tears, at least not yet, but from pure shock. I had been standing near the kitchen counter holding a plate I'd just rinsed. My mom's new husband Paul was leaning against the doorway with a beer in his hand, watching, or maybe observing is a better word. His face didn't move, didn't flinch. He just took it in like he was waiting for something. And then there was my mother. Her eyes were wild-wide and furious, the green in them almost glassy with rage. She stood so close that I could smell her perfume, the one she started wearing after Paul moved in. It wasn't the warm vanilla scent I grew up with, the one that reminded me of Christmas cookies and Saturday mornings. No. This one was sharp and cold, like citrus and metal. Her voice trembled half from anger and half from something else I couldn't place. "You don't talk to me like that," she hissed. "Not in my house." The words echoed in my skull. My house. I wanted to scream that it was my house too, that I'd lived here long before Paul showed up, that I'd been the one waiting up late at night while she went on dates, the one eating cereal for dinner when she worked double shifts. But my tongue was heavy, stuck to the roof of my mouth. My cheek throbbed where her hand had landed, a hot, pulsating reminder of how quickly everything had changed. I forced myself not to cry. Crying would only make it worse. She hated when I cried, said it made me look weak, said I was too sensitive, too soft. I turned slightly and caught Paul's eyes. They were dark, unreadable. He didn't move, he didn't say anything. He just stared at me. No pity, no judgment, just something. Something I couldn't name at the time. And that's when the shame sank in, heavy and suffocating. Because what's worse than being hit by your own mother isn't the pain. It's the humiliation. It's knowing someone else saw it. Knowing that a stranger, this man who'd only been in our lives for 6 months now, carried that piece of me. For a second, I wondered if I'd imagined it all. If maybe I'd pushed her too far. If I deserved it. That's what she always made me feel anyway, that her anger was my fault, that I was the trigger. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered the truth. It wasn't always like this. I closed my eyes, and for a flicker of a moment, I remembered the mother I used to know. When I was little, she'd braid my hair before school and kiss the top of my head. She used to leave little notes in my lunchbox, crooked hearts drawn on napkins, silly doodles of cats, reminders that she loved me. She worked so hard, sometimes 2 or 3 jobs at once, but she always found time to sit with me on the couch and watch old movies. She was warm then. Tired, yes, but warm. Back then it felt like we were a team, just her and me against the world. And then Paul came. After he moved in, her laughter changed. It was louder but emptier. She started dressing differently, started wearing heels around the house. She cooked big dinners, ones she never bothered with before, like she was trying to impress him. And she started looking at me differently too, less like a daughter, more like an inconvenience, a weight. I guess I never realized how fragile our little world was until he walked through the door. The plate I'd been holding slipped slightly in my hand. I set it down carefully, afraid any sudden movement might set her off again. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Paul shifted his weight but said nothing. His silence felt louder than anything. I searched his face for some sign, disapproval, anger, anything. But there was nothing. Just that same still expression. I think that hurt almost as much as the slap. I wanted him to defend me. I wanted him to say, "Hey, stop, that's not okay." But instead he just stood there like a man watching a storm he already knew was coming. I finally backed away, swallowing the lump in my throat. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. My mom turned away, exhaling sharply, like she'd just let out something poisonous, and started wiping down the counter like nothing happened. And me. I slipped quietly down the hallway to my room, clutching my own arms, like I could hold myself together if I just squeezed hard enough. But as I reached my door, I turned back for one last look. Paul was still standing there. Only now his eyes weren't on my mother. They were on me. And for just a split second, I saw something flickering in his gaze. Not sympathy, not even guilt. It was knowledge. Something in that look told me he knew more than he was letting on. That he wasn't just a witness. He was carrying a secret. I didn't know it then, but the man standing beside her wasn't just a silent bystander. He was holding the key to a betrayal that would shatter everything I believed about my mother. I grew up in a small, faded neighborhood on the outskirts of Cincinnati, the kind of suburban place where every house looked the same, but somehow felt different inside. Our home was a modest two-bedroom rental with peeling paint on the porch railings and a front yard that never quite managed to stay green. It was just my mom and me for as long as I can remember. She had me when she was 21, barely older than I am now. Dad, whoever he was, never stayed long enough to even leave a photograph. When I was younger, I'd ask about him, and she'd brush it off with a bitter laugh. "You don't need a man who didn't want to stay," she'd say, her lips curling around the words like they were poison. Eventually, I stopped asking. Mom was beautiful in a way that seemed effortless, but also calculated. She had long chestnut hair she dyed religiously every 6 weeks, hazel eyes that shifted with the light, and a slim figure she guarded fiercely. People would stare when we walked into the grocery store, men smiling at her like she was someone worth chasing. She was magnetic, bright, and charming when she wanted to be. But at home, the shine wore off. I learned early that her love came in pieces. She could be warm, sweet, even, but it was never steady. Her affection felt like sunlight peeking through heavy clouds. It would warm you for a fleeting moment before disappearing, leaving you cold all over again. When I was a kid, I tried to make her happy in every way I could. I cleaned up after myself without being told, got good grades, and never caused trouble. I'd sit at the kitchen table doing my homework while she smoked a cigarette by the window, staring into the dark, like she was somewhere else entirely. I remember one day in 3rd grade, I brought home a watercolor painting I was so proud of. It was messy, but I'd worked so hard blending the colors. I held it out to her with a shy smile, hoping for a rare compliment. She glanced at it, exhaled a cloud of smoke, and muttered, "You should have used less blue. It looks sad." Then she set it down without another word. It was always like that. I'd try, and she'd find the flaw. Still, there were moments, small, fragile moments, that kept me hoping. On my 12th birthday, she surprised me with a cake from the bakery. She actually sang "Happy Birthday" softly, her voice awkward but sincere. And for that one evening, we laughed together, like we were just two normal people, not a mother who didn't know how to love, and a daughter desperate to be loved. Or the winter we stayed up late watching old Audrey Hepburn movies on VHS because the heater broke and we were too cold to sleep. She draped an extra blanket around my shoulders and kissed the top of my head. "We're survivors, you and me," she whispered. Those tiny sparks of kindness made me believe there was more to her than the sharp edges, but they never lasted long. Her temper was like a storm, sudden and impossible to predict. One minute she was fine humming along to the radio while cooking dinner, and the next she'd slam the pan down because she'd burned the chicken. The sound of her voice would rise like a knife being sharpened. Sometimes it was just words, harsh cutting ones that made me feel small. "Why can't you do anything right? You're just like him." Other times it was worse. Once when I was 14, I accidentally spilled orange juice on the rug. She'd just gotten home from a long shift and I could see the exhaustion on her face. But instead of just sighing or telling me to clean it up, she snapped. She shoved me hard enough that I stumbled back into the wall. "I can't do everything, Emily," she screamed, her eyes glassy with something deeper than anger. I remember standing there frozen, clutching a roll of paper towels, too scared to speak. She apologized later, sort of. She sat on the couch, head in her hands, and said she didn't mean it. That she was just tired. That life wasn't fair to her. I nodded because I didn't know what else to do. I learned how to disappear without leaving the room. Books became my refuge. I spent hours buried in stories where mothers baked cookies and hugged their kids tight, where love didn't feel like walking through a minefield. I filled journals with words I couldn't say out loud, my feelings, my fears, my little victories. No one noticed. And music. Music was my escape hatch. I'd put in my earbuds and let songs carry me somewhere softer, somewhere where no one yelled and no one hit. I became quiet, cautious. I learned to read her moods like a weather report, knowing when to stay silent and when to offer a smile. But no matter how much I tried, I never seemed to get it right. I was never enough. Not smart enough. Not pretty enough. Not obedient enough. Even so, a part of me still loved her. Maybe because she was all I had. I think that's what made it hurt the most, the way she could make me feel safe one day and unwanted the next. Like she was two people living in the same body, the woman who braided my hair and whispered that we were a team, and the woman whose hand would shake with fury when she looked at me like I was the reason for everything wrong in her life. It's strange how you can love someone and fear them at the same time. That was my mother, a woman who loved in pieces. And I, quiet, eager to please Emily, was always there trying to hold those pieces together, even when they cut me. I didn't realize it back then, but those years were preparing me, teaching me how to survive her moods, her silence, her rage, teaching me resilience in a house where softness was punished. And yet nothing could have prepared me for Paul. Because when he walked into our lives, the balance shifted in a way I didn't understand. She became sharper, colder, more distant than ever before. And me, I became invisible in my own home. But I didn't know yet that Paul wasn't just another man. He was the thread that would unravel everything. My mother met Paul on an online dating site. I remember the night she told me about him. I was sitting at the kitchen table, eating a bowl of microwaved macaroni, while she leaned against the counter, her phone lighting up her face. She had this shy smile I hadn't seen in years, the kind she used to wear back when she was still young enough to believe in romance. "His name is Paul," she said, almost like she was testing how it sounded. "He's different. Different." She said it the way some women talk about finding a diamond in a pile of rocks. She told me he was a construction manager, a man who knew how to work with his hands. Divorced. No kids. Stable, she called him. Not like the others. I just nodded, shoving another bite into my mouth. I'd heard her talk about men before, always with that spark of hope that burned out as fast as it came. So I didn't think much of it. But this time was different. 2 weeks later, Paul came over for dinner. I remember everything about that night. It was the first time I'd seen my mother cook something that wasn't out of a box or from a drive-through bag. The table was set with the good plates we never used. She even bought a bottle of cheap wine and lit a candle like we were suddenly a family who did these things. When he walked in, I felt an odd mix of curiosity and dread. Paul was tall, broad-shouldered, with sandy blonde hair that was just starting to gray at the temples. He had the kind of face that seemed both approachable and guarded at the same time. His handshake was firm, but not overbearing, and when he looked at me, his eyes softened in a way that made me feel seen, something my mom rarely managed anymore. "Emily, right?" he said with a small smile. "Your mom talks about you all the time." I didn't know if that was true, but I smiled politely and murmured hello. Dinner was awkward. Mom was nervous, trying too hard. She laughed a little too loud at his jokes and kept smoothing down her hair like a teenager on her first date. I mostly stayed quiet, poking at the chicken she made, stealing glances at him when I thought no one noticed. He was polite, gentle in the way he spoke, calmer than I expected. There was something steady about him, something that felt out of place in our house where everything always felt like walking on eggshells. But there was also something I couldn't quite put my finger on. After that night, things began to change. It started small. Mom bought new clothes, skirts, and blouses that hugged her body in ways she never bothered with before. She began wearing makeup every day, even when she wasn't leaving the house. She switched her vanilla perfume for something sharper, something that lingered in the air like an announcement. And then she started changing with me. She became more controlling, more watchful. Suddenly, my clothes weren't appropriate anymore. My hair needed to be neater. She criticized the way I sat, the way I spoke. "You need to make a good impression, Emily," she'd say, as if Paul's opinion of me mattered more than my own. For the first time, I felt like an outsider in my own home. The space that used to belong to just the two of us became a stage for her performance. She was no longer just my mom, she was someone else entirely when he was around, lighter, flirtier, but also more distant from me. I'd walk into the living room and find them sitting close on the couch, whispering, laughing softly. When I came in, she'd glance at me, her expression tight, like I'd interrupted something important. I started spending more time in my room, feeling like a guest in my own life. But Paul, he was harder to figure out. He never raised his voice, never seemed impatient. When I spoke, he actually listened. One evening, a few months after he started coming around, I came home from cheerleading practice with bruises on my knees and a sore wrist from a bad landing. Mom barely looked up from her phone when I limped past her. But Paul noticed. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, leaning against the doorway with a concerned frown. I hesitated, startled that he even cared. "Yeah, just practice." He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the bruises. "Be careful. You've only got one body, you know." It was such a simple thing, but it felt strange foreign. He said it in a way that felt protective, not critical. My mom had never sounded like that. Another time he caught me biting at my fingernails while I was studying at the kitchen table. Mom was in the other room yelling into the phone about some bill she couldn't pay. Paul walked by, paused, and gently said, "Anxiety habit." I blinked, not sure how to respond. He smiled faintly. "I used to do the same thing as a kid. It helps for a second, but makes it worse later." He didn't scold me, he just noticed. It was unsettling, because he saw things in me my own mother ignored. But there was something else about him, something beneath the calm exterior that didn't quite fit. Sometimes I'd catch him watching my mom with this look, not love exactly, but something heavier, like he was carrying a weight he couldn't share. And once late at night, I overheard him on the phone in the hallway. His voice was low, serious. I couldn't catch every word, but I heard enough. "She hasn't told her. I don't think she ever will." My heart raced. She hasn't told her what? When he saw me peeking around the corner, he ended the call abruptly. He gave me a small, careful smile, like he'd just been caught holding a secret. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly. I nodded, unable to speak. "Get some rest, Emily," he said, his tone gentle, but knowing. Like he already understood more about my life and my mother than I did. Looking back, that was the beginning of the unraveling. I didn't realize it then, but Paul wasn't just another man my mom had brought into our lives. He was a mirror reflecting things she didn't want me to see. And deep down, I think he knew exactly what kind of woman she really was. It started with a glass, just an ordinary drinking glass I'd accidentally dropped in the sink after dinner. The water was still running, soap suds floating around like tiny clouds, and my hands were slippery from rinsing the dishes. It slipped from my fingers, hit the edge of the sink, and shattered into a dozen sharp pieces. It was such a small thing, something anyone could have done. But the sound of breaking glass echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. My mother spun around so fast I barely had time to breathe. She'd been sitting at the table scrolling through her phone, while Paul leaned against the doorway with his quiet, beer-in-hand posture. Her eyes locked onto me, and I knew this wasn't going to end like a normal mistake. "Emily," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut skin. "Are you kidding me? I'm sorry, it just... Don't!" She stood up so suddenly, the chair scraped hard against the floor. "Don't you dare give me excuses. Do you have any idea how careless you are? You can't even wash a damn dish without making a mess." I froze, holding the faucet handle like it was a lifeline. My heart started pounding, a heavy thump in my ears. "It's just a glass," I said quietly. I shouldn't have said it. I know that now. But it slipped out too soft to be defiant, but enough to ignite her. Her face changed. She stepped closer, her hands trembling not with fear, but with rage. "Just a glass. You don't get to talk back to me in my house." I swallowed hard, the familiar taste of dread in my throat. Paul didn't move. He just watched, his expression unreadable. But his eyes, There was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Something heavy. I didn't mean I started, but she was already in front of me. The slap came so fast I barely saw it. Her palm cracked across my cheek with a force that made me stumble backward against the counter. The sting was immediate, hot and sharp, my skin burning. And she didn't stop. She grabbed my wrist, shaking me so hard my teeth clattered. "You think you can just waltz in here, act like a little princess, while I do everything? You're useless, Emily. Do you hear me? Useless." My breath caught in my chest. Tears blurred my vision, but I refused to let them fall. I couldn't give her that satisfaction. I felt the edge of the counter digging into my lower back, trapping me. Paul finally shifted. Not toward us, just slightly, like he wanted to move but couldn't. His face tightened, and for a fleeting second, I saw it. Disgust, guilt, sadness, all flickering at once. But still, he didn't say a word. "Mom, please," I whispered. My voice cracked small and pathetic in the suffocating silence that followed her outburst. And just like that, she let go. She exhaled sharply, almost as if she'd expelled something toxic from her body. Her hands dropped to her sides. Then she turned back to the table, picked up her phone, and sat down like nothing had happened. I stood there frozen, my cheek throbbing, my breath shallow. When I finally glanced at Paul, he was still staring at me. Not like a man who didn't care, but like one who was carrying a secret he couldn't release. His jaw was tight, his beer hung limply in his hand. But he didn't speak. Why didn't he stop her? Why didn't anyone ever stop her? I cleaned up the shards of glass in silence, my hands trembling as I picked them out of the sink. Mom hummed quietly, scrolling through her phone like she'd already forgotten what she'd just done. When the last piece was in the trash, I mumbled something about going to my room. She didn't even look up. "Yeah, fine," she said. "And next time, be more careful. I don't have money to keep replacing things you break." Her words sliced deeper than the slap. Gaslighting, that's what they call it now. Back then it just felt like insanity. One minute she was a hurricane, the next she was calm, pretending there'd never been a storm at all. I locked my bedroom door and sank onto my bed, hugging my knees. The room felt too small, too tight. My face still burned where her hand had landed, and my chest ached with the kind of humiliation that seeps into your bones. I thought about Paul, how he'd just stood there, how his silence was almost louder than her screaming. I wanted him to be different. I wanted him to step in to tell her to stop. But he hadn't. I pressed my forehead to my knees and tried to breathe. Hours passed. It was late when I heard the knock, 3 soft raps against my door. Emily Paul's voice was quiet, cautious. I wiped my face quickly and sat up. "Yeah." There was a pause, like he was deciding whether to continue. Then, "Can I come in for a second?" I hesitated, then unlocked the door. He stepped inside slowly, like he was entering sacred ground. He didn't look at me right away. His gaze fell on the bruise forming on my cheek, and I saw his jaw tighten again. "I'm sorry about earlier," he said finally. I frowned. "Why, you didn't do anything. That's the problem." His voice was low, almost to himself. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly fighting some internal battle. "Why didn't you stop her?" The words slipped out before I could catch them. He looked at me, then really looked at me, his eyes shadowed with something I couldn't name. "Because—" he started, then stopped. His lips pressed into a thin line. "Because what I whispered." Another long pause. "Because it's complicated," he said softly. Then he turned his hand lingering on the doorframe. "Just be careful, Emily." "Okay." And then he left, leaving me with more questions than answers. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the entire scene in my head. The slap, the silence, his face. Something about the way he looked at me. It wasn't just pity. It was like he knew. Like he'd been waiting for this moment to happen. And deep down, a cold realization settled in my chest. Whatever Paul wasn't saying, whatever secret he was holding, had something to do with her. Something I wasn't supposed to know. The weeks after the slap felt strangely quiet, but not in a peaceful way, more like the kind of silence that creeps in before a storm. Paul was different, not in a big obvious way, but in little moments that caught me off guard. Sometimes after Mom left for work, I'd come downstairs and find a sticky note on the counter. "Hang in there. You're stronger than you think." Or, "Made extra coffee for you, hope today's better." They were simple gestures, but they felt so out of place in a house where kindness was rare. And sometimes when Mom snapped at me over something trivial, I'd catch Paul's eyes flicker with quiet disapproval. He wouldn't say anything directly, never in front of her, but he'd linger afterward, offering a small, almost apologetic smile, as if to say, "I see you. I'm sorry." But those soft moments were balanced by new unsettling clues that made me feel like something was shifting beneath the surface. Chang. It started with the mail. I was grabbing the envelopes off the porch one afternoon when I saw one that looked official. Thick paper, no return address. My name wasn't on it, but curiosity got the better of me. I flipped it over and my stomach dropped. It wasn't addressed to Paul or Mom. It was addressed to someone else entirely. Catherine M. Carter. My mom's full name. The one she hated. I hesitated, staring at it. Mom always went by Kate. She never used her middle initial. I traced the unfamiliar handwriting and noticed something else. There was a faint crease, like a photograph was inside. I don't know what made me do it, but I opened it. Inside was a single black and white photo, slightly faded around the edges. It showed a much younger Mom, maybe in her 20s, standing next to a man I didn't recognize. They were laughing, holding hands, and at her feet was a baby stroller. My heart pounded. There was a note scrawled on the back. "She looks just like him." Before I could process it, I heard Mom's car pull into the driveway. My panic surged. I shoved the photo and letter back into the envelope and stuffed it under a pile of magazines on the coffee table. My hands were shaking when I handed her the rest of the mail. She didn't notice, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was the man in the photo, and who was the she in that message? Not long after, another piece fell into place. I was cleaning out the junk drawer in the kitchen when I found a small old key. I didn't know what it was for, but I felt that familiar rush of curiosity mixed with dread. Later that night, when Mom was asleep, I followed my gut. I tried the key on the drawer in her bedroom that was always locked. It opened. Inside were papers, receipts, and at the bottom, a stack of photographs. One photo stopped me cold. It was my mother holding a newborn baby in the hospital. But it wasn't me. I could tell. I didn't recognize the blanket, the room, or the faint smile on her face. And tucked behind it was another envelope, this one addressed to Paul. I didn't have time to read it, because just then I heard footsteps. Paul was standing in the doorway. He didn't look angry, but his face was pale. "Emily," he said quietly, almost gently, "you shouldn't be in here." I froze, the photo still in my hand. "What is this?" My voice was barely a whisper. His eyes softened in that way they always did when he wanted to say more, but couldn't. He stepped closer, carefully taking the photo from my trembling fingers and sliding it back into the drawer. "Some things." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Some things aren't ready to be talked about yet." I stared at him, my throat tight. "Is it about Mom?" A long silence. Then he nodded, just barely. "Does it have to do with me?" His gaze faltered. For a split second, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Hesitation. And guilt. Before he could answer, Mom called from downstairs. Paul glanced at the door, then back at me. "Not now," he said softly. "Please. Trust me." And just like that, the moment was gone. A few nights later, I heard them arguing. Their voices carried down the hallway, sharp and raw. She deserves to know. Kate Paul's voice was louder than I'd ever heard it. "You can't keep lying to her like this. It's not fair." "Don't you dare," Mom snapped back. Her tone was like ice. "It's not your place to tell her. This is my life, my choice. She's not a child anymore. She's 17, Kate. She has a right to." No, Mom's voice cracked. If you say a word, I swear you'll regret it. I pressed my back against the wall, my heart racing. What didn't I know? What could possibly be so bad that they'd fight like this over it? Paul said something else, but his voice dropped muffled. Then Mom stormed out of the room, slamming the door so hard the floorboards shook. When she passed me in the hallway, her face was pale and tight. She didn't even notice me standing there. Paul stayed inside the room. I wanted to knock. I wanted to ask him what he meant. But I couldn't move. Tam. From then on, the tension in the house was suffocating. Mom grew more erratic. She'd alternate between being overly sweet, making breakfast, asking about my day, and being colder than ever, snapping at me for the smallest things. Her moods shifted like quicksand. Paul, on the other hand, grew more protective in quiet ways. He'd slip encouraging notes under my door. Once he even defended me when Mom criticized me for spending too much time in my room. "She's a teenager, Kate," he said calmly. "Give her some space." Mom shot him a look that could kill. But even his kindness didn't feel simple. It felt layered, like he was taking care of me, not just out of decency, but out of guilt. I started feeling like I was living in someone else's story, like the walls around me were holding secrets I wasn't supposed to see. I didn't know what they were hiding, but deep down I knew it was big, and I had a terrible sinking feeling it had everything to do with me. It happened on a rainy Thursday night, the kind of night where the world feels smaller, quieter. Mom was working late, or at least that's what she said. I was in the living room, half distracted by a book, but mostly listening to the rain tapping against the windows. Paul came in quietly carrying 2 mugs of tea. He didn't say anything at first. He just set one mug down on the coffee table in front of me and sat across from me. There was a heaviness in his posture, like he was carrying something too big to keep inside anymore. "Emily," he began, his voice softer than usual. "I think it's time you knew the truth." I froze. The truth. Those words felt like a warning. I set the book down. My heart started pounding. The truth about what? He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes full of something I couldn't name. Regret, maybe. Sadness. And guilt. "About your father," he said. For as long as I could remember, my mother told me my dad was a mistake, a nameless man who left before I was even born. Whenever I'd ask for details, she'd shut down the conversation. "He doesn't matter. He never wanted you. End of story." So I learned to bury the questions. But now Paul was looking at me like every single thing I'd been told was a lie. "Your father wasn't some random man who disappeared," Paul said carefully. "He was someone you've actually met." My stomach dropped. "Met? What do you mean?" Paul took a deep breath. "Emily, your biological father is Richard Harmon." The name hit me like a punch. Richard Harmon. My mom's old boss. The man who lived 2 streets over. The man whose daughter, Heather, had been my childhood best friend. "No," I whispered. That's impossible." Paul shook his head slowly. "It's not impossible. It's the truth. Your mom and Richard had an affair while he was still married. When she got pregnant with you, she wanted him to leave his family. He wouldn't. He stayed with his wife, but he paid her to keep quiet, to keep you a secret." I stared at him, the room spinning. "You're saying Heather's dad is my dad?" "Yes," Paul said. "Heather is your half-sister." I felt like I couldn't breathe. Memories flooded my mind. Sleepovers at Heather's house. Richard giving me rides home, the way my mom's face would tighten whenever I mentioned their family. "Oh my God," I choked out. She knew all this time." "Yes," Paul said. "She's known. She made sure no one would ever tell you." But he wasn't finished. "There's more," he said quietly. I didn't want more. I wanted it to stop, but I couldn't look away. "Before you were born," Paul continued, "your mom had another baby, a little boy. She was 19. She gave him up for adoption. She never told anyone, not even her parents. She just walked away." My mouth went dry. "She abandoned him." Yes, I felt sick. Paul's voice grew heavier. When I met your mom, I already knew about her past. I knew the kind of person she could be when she wanted something. I married her because I thought, maybe I could protect you. I could be here to make sure you didn't end up like one of her secrets. I stared at him numb. You knew? You knew all of this? And you didn't tell me? He flinched. I wanted to. God, Emily, I wanted to tell you 100 times. But she threatened to cut me out completely. She said she'd make your life even worse if I interfered. I thought, at least if I stayed, I could shield you from the worst of her. I couldn't speak. Anger hit first. Hot, burning, unstoppable. All those years, every time I'd stared at the mirror wondering who I looked like. Every time I'd sat through school events with no dad in the audience. Every time she made me feel like I was the mistake. She knew. She knew I had a father who lived right down the street. She knew I had a half-sister who shared my blood. And she let me grow up believing I was unwanted. Then came the grief. Heavy. Crushing. Because the person who was supposed to love me unconditionally, the one person I should have been able to trust, had lied about the most fundamental part of who I was. And finally, there was something else I didn't expect. Relief. Because even though the truth hurt, it also explained everything. Why she was so cold. Why she was so afraid of anyone else getting too close. Why she'd spent her life controlling the narrative. It wasn't me. I wasn't the reason she was broken. She'd been broken long before me. Paul watched me silently, as tears streamed down my face. He didn't try to hug me or tell me it would be okay. Maybe he knew it wouldn't be. I'm sorry, he said finally, his voice low. I should have told you sooner. I just didn't know how. I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve, staring at the floor. What am I supposed to do with this? I whispered. I don't know, he admitted. But at least now you know the truth. You deserve that much, guy. The rest of the night was a blur. I locked myself in my room, clutching the old journal I kept hidden under my bed. I wrote until my hand cramped, pouring everything onto the pages, my rage, my confusion, my heartbreak. I thought about Heather, about Richard, about the boy my mother abandoned, and I thought about Mom, about the version of her I'd loved as a little girl, about the version of her that was left now a stranger who wore my mother's face. By the time I finally lay down, one thought kept circling in my mind like a storm I couldn't escape. I didn't know who I was anymore. But I knew one thing for sure. I could never look at my mother the same way again. I waited until she came home the next evening. I didn't plan it. I didn't rehearse the words. I just knew I couldn't keep carrying the weight of what I'd learned. It felt like poison sitting inside my chest, and the only way to survive was to let it out. The front door creaked open. I heard the click of her heels on the hardwood, the rustle of her bag being dropped on the counter. She looked radiant in that brittle way she always did when she came back from work. Flawless makeup, a dress a little too tight, her perfume cutting through the air. Emily, she called. Where's Paul? I stepped into the living room, my heart pounding so hard it made my ears ring. She froze when she saw me. Maybe it was something in my face. Something she couldn't quite read, but recognized as dangerous. We need to talk, I said. My voice sounded flat, too calm. Her eyes narrowed. About what I swallowed. About my father. For a split second I saw it, the flicker of panic in her eyes before she smoothed her face into that familiar mask. What about him? She asked casually, shrugging off her coat. Don't. My voice cracked. Don't lie to me anymore. I know who he is. I know about Richard Harmon. I know about Heather. She froze her coat, slipping halfway off her shoulders. And I know about the baby you gave away before me, I whispered. The color drained from her face. For a moment the house was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. Then she laughed low, bitter, like a cornered animal. Paul, she said sharply. He told you, didn't he? I shook my head. I found out. He just confirmed it. She dropped her coat on the chair and straightened her eyes, blazing. You had no right to go digging through my things. You had no right to lie to me my whole life. My voice finally rose, years of hurt clawing their way out. You let me grow up thinking I was unwanted, like I didn't matter. All this time my dad lived 2 streets away. Heather is my sister, and you stole that from me. Her mouth twisted, but she didn't deny it. What was I supposed to do? She snapped. Tell you that your father was a coward who wouldn't leave his perfect little family for me, that he paid me off like I was nothing. Would that have made your life better? Yes, I shouted. At least it would have been the truth. Her voice dropped, sharp and venomous. You think you can handle the truth? You can barely handle life, Emily. I did what I had to do. I raised you on my own. I protected you from the shame. Shame. I felt my throat tighten. No, you protected yourself. You didn't care what it did to me. You just wanted to control the story. Paul appeared in the doorway, then his face grim. Kate, he said quietly. Stop. But she turned on him like a viper. This is your fault. You never should have told her. She had a right to know, he cut in, his voice firm. You've lied to her long enough. Her eyes flashed. You don't get to lecture me. You knew exactly who I was when you married me. Yes, Paul said softly. I knew. And I thought maybe I could help you, or at least protect her from you. But I can't anymore. Her breath hitched, and for a moment her mask cracked. I saw something raw in her expression. Fear, shame, and beneath it all, emptiness. You don't know what it's like, she whispered, her voice trembling. To be 19 and alone, to have nothing. To love someone who doesn't love you back. You don't know what it's like to give up a child because you have no choice. Her words might have stung if they'd come with an ounce of remorse, but they didn't. I stared at her, my anger finally cooling into something worse, disbelief. You could have been honest with me, I said quietly. But you chose to lie. You let me grow up thinking I wasn't worth the truth. And I can't forgive that. She straightened her chin, lifting like she was preparing for battle. You don't get to judge me. You're still just a child. Someday you'll understand why I did what I did. No, I said, shaking my head. I'll never understand. And I don't want to. Paul stepped closer to me, putting himself between us. His voice was calm but final. Kate, you need help, he said. And if you can't admit that, then I can't stay here, not like this. Her face twisted in panic. You're leaving? After everything? He looked at her with something like pity. I stayed for Emily. But she's almost grown now. She doesn't need you the way she used to. And you? You don't want anyone who won't let you control them. Her breathing quickened. She looked smaller suddenly, like the air had been sucked out of her. Don't do this, she whispered. Don't leave me like he did. But Paul didn't answer. I looked at my mother, really looked at her. For the first time, I didn't see the terrifying figure I'd feared my whole life. I just saw a hollow woman trapped by her own lies, a woman who didn't know how to love without possession. Something inside me broke then, not in a violent way, but in a quiet, final one. I can't stay here, I said. Her head snapped toward me. What? I can't do this anymore. I need to go. My voice cracked, for my own sanity. Her lips parted like she wanted to say something, but no words came. That night I packed a small bag, just enough for a few days. I didn't know where I'd go, maybe a friend's house, maybe nowhere. But I knew I couldn't sleep under that roof anymore. Paul helped me carry my bag to the car. He didn't try to convince me to stay. He just put a hand on my shoulder and said, You're doing the right thing. You deserve better than this. When I glanced back at the house, I saw her standing in the window. Her silhouette looked small, almost fragile, but I couldn't tell if she was watching me leave or staring through me like I was already gone. Either way, I didn't look back again. The life we'd built, the fragile, cracked version of a family, collapsed in one night. But in that collapse, I finally found something I'd never had before, the chance to start over. I didn't know what freedom would feel like until the day I stepped into my own space. It wasn't anything glamorous, just a tiny studio apartment on the edge of town, with creaky floors, a secondhand couch, and a window that overlooked a laundromat. but it was mine. No shouting, no slamming doors, no walking on eggshells waiting for someone else's mood to decide my day. The first night I sat on the floor surrounded by boxes eating takeout straight from the container. It was quiet, too quiet at first, but the silence didn't feel suffocating anymore. It felt safe. I started therapy the next week. At first I didn't even know what to say. How do you explain a lifetime of secrets and shame in an hour? But my therapist just nodded, patient and gentle, guiding me through the pieces I'd never spoken out loud before. I began journaling again too. Pages and pages of words I'd been holding inside for years spilled out. The anger, the grief, the confusion, and slowly little threads of understanding started to weave through the chaos. I realized that I'd spent so long trying to be the daughter my mother wanted that I didn't even know who I wanted to be. So I started figuring it out. Paul stayed in touch. He came by once a week bringing groceries or just sitting with me over coffee. There was no big talk about the past, no awkward apologies. He didn't push. He just showed up. One Saturday morning, he handed me a small envelope. Inside was a simple note. "You're not defined by her. You never were. Proud of you, kid." It made me cry in a way my mother's words never had because it felt real. Paul wasn't perfect. He'd made his own mistakes. But in the end, he'd been more of a father figure than anyone else in my life. And in his quiet way, he gave me something my mother never could, a sense of being seen without judgment. So, over time I started to understand something about family. It's not just about blood. Blood can betray you. It can lie. It can abandon you. Family is trust. It's love that doesn't need conditions. It's the people who stay, not because they have to, but because they want to. I didn't have that with my mother. But I began to find it in small, unexpected places like in a friend who called every Sunday to check in, or in a professor who encouraged me to write my story, or in the quiet resilience I found in myself, Sam. Months passed. Seasons changed. I thought about Mom sometimes, not in the way I used to, no longer with that ache for her approval, but with a complicated mix of sadness and acceptance. I knew she was still in the same house, probably convincing herself she'd been right all along. But I couldn't live in her shadow anymore. One evening, I sat at my little kitchen table and picked up a pen. I wrote her a letter. Not of anger, not of accusation, but of release. I told her I knew why she lied, even if I couldn't forgive it. I told her I hoped she'd find peace, even if we never spoke again. I told her I didn't hate her, because hate was just another way of holding on. And at the end, I wrote the words I'd been needing to say for years: I'm letting go. I hope someday you can too. I sealed the envelope not knowing if I'd ever actually send it. But writing it felt like closing a door that had been open for too long. Now when I wake up in my little apartment, I feel something I didn't think I'd ever feel: hope. I've learned that healing isn't a straight line. Some days the old wounds still sting, but they don't define me anymore. I'm more than her lies, more than her mistakes. I may never get the mother I needed, but I learned to mother myself, and that saved me.